a surprising headline, isn't it? Seeing this pop up in May 2025, Alberta, the oil-rich province.
Hmm.
Suddenly seeing this real resurgence in separatist talk,
Yeah.
especially for Canada with its long history of, well, unity. It definitely makes you look twice.
It does seem a bit counterintuitive, yeah, on the surface at least.
Huh.
But if you dig down a bit, you can start to see the currents, the things driving this renewed conversation about Alberta's place in Canada.
Okay, so that's exactly what we're going to do here, this deep dive. It's all about understanding those forces. We're looking at recent news, public discussion, basically trying to get to the heart of it. Our mission, really, is to cut through the noise for you, grasp the core issues, and maybe what they signal for Canadian unity down the road.
Sounds good.
And the spark, it seems, or at least a big part of it, is Premier Danielle Smith's announcement back in May 2025, floating this idea, this potential citizen-led referendum on separation. 2026, maybe, if a petition gets, 177,000 signatures?
Mhm.
That feels like the central thing we need to unpack today.
That announcement is definitely a big marker, yeah. But you're right, it doesn't come out of nowhere. It's really the culmination of a long history, different perspectives, grievances in Alberta. To really get this moment, we have to look back a bit.
Absolutely. These feelings didn't just appear yesterday. Our sources point way back, actually. The 1970s, the National Energy Program. That seems like a key starting point.
Oh, definitely. The NEP.
What was the lasting impact of that on how Alberta saw itself and the rest of Canada?
Well, the NEP, I mean, the intention was supposedly managing oil for all Canadians, right? But in Alberta, it was seen as a direct hit, an assault on their jurisdiction, their economy. It wasn't just economic pain. It left this deep feeling of being, misunderstood, exploited, even by central Canada. And that feeling, it still fuels things today. It's like a lens they view federal policy through.
That makes sense. That kind of historical wound, almost.
You could say that, yeah.
So, okay, with that background, what are the more recent sparks? What's fanning the flames now? We keep seeing things like federal carbon taxes, pipeline restrictions, Bill C-69 gets mentioned a lot. How are those playing out in Alberta?
Right, so those recent policies, they're often seen as just, more of the same, that historical pattern repeating. Many Albertans see it as Ottawa interfering again, hurting their main industry, oil and gas. Carbon taxes hit harder, arguably, in a province so reliant on fossil fuels. And things like Bill C-69, they're seen as actively blocking market access, stopping growth, stopping investment. It just feeds that feeling, Ottawa working against them.
And then there's the old favorite, equalization payments. Always a flashpoint. For listeners maybe not deep in Canadian fiscal stuff, can you give us the quick version? Why is this such a sore spot in Alberta?
So equalization, it's a federal program. The idea is to spread tax money around from richer provinces to less wealthy ones. The goal is comparable public services everywhere. Simple enough on paper. But Alberta's issue is, as a province that contributes a lot historically, many feel they don't get a fair shake. There's this perception. We send huge amounts of money out, and what do we get back? Policies that seem to hurt our own economy. So it fuels that sense of unfairness and the argument that Alberta can manage its own money better.
Right. And adding fuel to that fire, the April 2025 federal election, the Liberals win again under Prime Minister Mark Carney. Alberta leans heavily UCP provincially. How did that election result land out west?
Yeah, that likely just amplified the feeling of political alienation, that sense of being out of step with Ottawa. Alberta has often been at odds with the governing party federally.
Yeah.
So another Liberal win, it probably reinforces that feeling. The feeling that their voice, their priorities, they just aren't being heard or acted on nationally. It strengthens the U.S. versus them argument.
Premier Smith even put a number on it, said federal policies cost Alberta over $500 billion in lost investment over the last decade. That's a huge number. Do our sources give any context for that, how it's calculated, or if there are other ways to look at it?
It is a massive figure, yeah. And the sources we looked at don't break down her specific math on that $500 billion.
Yeah.
But it's clear she's tapping into that narrative, that story of real economic harm from federal actions. Now, other analyses might give different numbers or, point to other global factors affecting investment. But that $500 billion figure, it definitely hits home for people in Alberta who feel left behind or blocked by Ottawa.
Okay, so you've got this history, these ongoing frustrations, and then Premier Smith opens this door, a potential referendum. Her stance feels careful, not quite shouting separate, but definitely creating a path for it. What's the strategy there, do you think?
It looks a bit like a dual strategy, perhaps. On one hand, by allowing this citizen petition, this referendum possibility, she's acknowledging that strong separatist feeling. especially within our own base, maybe trying to channel it.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it could also be, a calculated move. Pressure on Ottawa, threatening separation, even implicitly can be a pretty powerful bargaining chip if you want to renegotiate things.
And the process she laid out is specific. 177,000 signatures triggers a potential 2026 vote. And the question itself, proposed by the Alberta Prosperity Project, very direct. Do you agree that the province shall become a sovereign country and cease to be a province of Canada?
Yeah.
No messing around there.
It is remarkably clear, isn't it? Especially if you compare it to, say, some referendum questions we've seen before in Canada, Quebec, for instance. That lack of ambiguity, it could mean a much more decisive result if a vote actually happened.
But then Smith also talks about wanting a strong and sovereign Alberta within a united Canada. Those things almost sound contradictory. How do we read that?
Right. That phrase really captures her tightrope walk, doesn't it? Trying to find some middle ground. Or maybe, like we said, using the potential for separation to get more actual power, more autonomy within Canada. She's also proposed this Alberta Accord, right, to renegotiate with Ottawa. Focus on energy, exports. That fits the same pattern.
Okay. But not everyone's buying it. The Alberta NDP leader, Naheed Nenshi, he's been pretty critical, accusing Smith of basically playing with fire, stoking separatism for political points, and risking the whole country. What's his main argument?
Nenshi's point, and it's shared by a lot of critics, is that just talk about separation seriously, setting up this referendum process, it's inherently risky. He argues it creates economic uncertainty, scares off investors,
Right.
and damages the country's unity, the social fabric, whether the referendum passes or not. He basically sees it as a dangerous political game.
Okay, let's switch gears slightly. What are Albertans themselves thinking? We got some poll numbers from May 2025. Angus Reid found 36% leaning towards independence, and among UCP voters, a whopping 65%. That's significant support in her base.
That Angus Reid poll definitely shows a strong appetite for change. Yeah, particularly among government supporters, a significant chunk of people. But it's important, like you said, to look at other polls too. Get the whole picture. It's usually more nuanced.
Right, because then there's a Nanos poll. Around the same time, it said most Albertans actually think staying in Canada is better for the economy. And hardly anyone, like only 10%, wanted to join the U.S. What does that contrast tell us?
Well, the Nanos poll suggests that, okay, maybe there's frustration, lots of it even, but a majority still seem to see the practical economic upsides of being part of Canada and that very low support for joining the U.S. It suggests the focus for most isn't leaving North America, it's improving Alberta's deal within Canada.
And then a Ledger poll found, okay, over half see legitimate reasons to separate, but nationally, support for taking the threat seriously is kind of mixed.
Yeah, that's interesting too.
It feels like people acknowledge the grievances, but maybe aren't convinced separation is the answer.
Exactly. There seems to be a difference between saying, yeah, Alberta has some valid points, and saying, okay, let's break up the country.
Yeah.
Nationally, how to fix things for Alberta. Opinions probably vary a lot.
We should also talk about the groups pushing this. The Alberta Prosperity Project, the APP, seems like a key driver, backed by UCP insiders, apparently, aiming for 600,000 signatures, maybe an early referendum, fall 2025.
Right. The APP, they represent a, let's say, more organized and determined wing of this separatist movement. Those reported ties to UCP insiders, that suggests some influence within the governing party. And that big signature goal, wanting it fast, shows they want to move quickly. And their clear question, like we said, seems very strategic. Avoid past confusion.
Then there's the Republican Party of Alberta. Cameron Davies leading it, also pushing independence. And they claim some Indigenous support for renegotiating federal ties. How significant are they?
Maybe not as high profile as the APP, but the Republican Party of Alberta shows there's diversity within the movement, different arguments. That claim of Indigenous support is complex because Indigenous views on sovereignty, treaty rights, they're absolutely central here. But you need to look really closely at the specifics of that claim support. Who, what kind?
Okay. And on the other side, strong opposition. Calgary Mayor Jyoti Gondagek, Edmonton Mayor Amarjeet Sohi, calling the referendum idea dangerous for investment.
Makes sense.
Yeah, totally. From the perspective of the big cities, the economic hubs.
Exactly. As mayors of the two main economic centers, their worries about instability, scaring off investment, those are serious concerns, practical risks.
And the opposition from Indigenous leaders, Cindy Woodhouse-Nepanak from the Assembly of First Nations, for example, arguing separation violates treaty rights, vowing resistance. That feels like a fundamental roadblock, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Treaties between the Crown and First Nations are protected by the Constitution any unilateral move by Alberta to separate huge legal, ethical problems for those agreements.
Yeah.
So, yeah, unified opposition from Indigenous leadership is a very, very significant hurdle.
We also saw, flicking through social media like X, just how polarized things are. Really strong arguments back and forth.
Oh, yeah. Social media often reflects the loudest voices, the extremes sometimes, but the intensity online, it just underlines how deep this runs, how divided people are.
So let's say the momentum builds. Let's say, hypothetically, a referendum happens and passes. Our sources stress that actually becoming independent is incredibly complicated, legally, practically. That Supreme Court ruling from 1998 on Quebec secession comes up again. What were the key points there that apply to Alberta?
Right. The Supreme Court, they basically said, look, a province can try to secede, but not just like that, not unilaterally. They set conditions, a clear majority vote on a clear question.
Which the APP question arguably is.
It arguably is yes. But even then, a yes vote doesn't automatically mean independence. It just triggers an obligation for Ottawa, the other provinces, Indigenous groups, to negotiate in good faith. But it's the start of a process, not the end.
And that negotiation, wow. Dividing assets, debts, figuring out currency, trade deals, borders. It sounds like a nightmare.
It would be completely unprecedented, monumentally complex, touching every single aspect of how things work now. There just aren't easy answers to any of those huge questions.
Constitutional scholar Eric Adams warned about exactly that. Uncharted territory, he called it. Major economic uncertainty, investors getting spooked.
Yeah, Adams' point is crucial. That level of uncertainty, messing with the Constitution, it could absolutely lead to capital flight, chill investment, serious economic pain for Alberta.
And you can't forget how huge Alberta's oil and gas is, how tied it is to the North American economy, almost half U.S. crude imports, right? How would separation mess with those vital links?
Well, the energy sector is deeply tied into international trade. Yes, proponents might say, great, we'll have more control, find new markets. But untangling existing deals, ensuring you still have access to partners like the U.S., that would be a critical challenge, maybe a huge one.
So you hear the arguments. Proponents, independence frees us from Ottawa's rules. We're boom. Critics, you'll wreck trade, lose federal money. Sounds like a massive economic gamble, whichever way you slice it.
The economic cases on both sides, they're complex and full of what-ifs. Sure, more autonomy could bring benefits, regulatory freedom maybe, better resource management perhaps, but the risks are just as real. Market access, new trade barriers, losing those federal transfers, it's high stakes.
Even businesses in BC are speaking up, saying integrated trade routes across Canada are vital. It shows this isn't just an Alberta bubble issue, is it? It affects everyone.
Exactly. The Canadian economy is so interconnected. A major shock in one place ripples outwards. Provinces like BC, with strong trade with Alberta, they have a real stake in Canada staying together and stable.
And then there are these sort of external factors mentioned. Former U.S. President Trump's old comments about annexing Canada. A bit weird, but it's out there.
Yeah, those comments probably more Trump being Trump than serious policy.
Probably.
But it's maybe a tiny reminder that in a huge geopolitical shift, like Canada potentially splitting up, outside players could take an interest. Unlikely, but,
Right. And back to the core drivers. That feeling in Alberta, strongly pushed by Premier Smith, that current federal policies, Liberal, NDP supported, are actively hurting the province's economy. That fundamental clash with Ottawa's direction seems key.
Yeah, that perception, being fundamentally at odds with where the federal government is going, that's a core grievance. It really fuels that desire for more control, for their own economic path.
It was interesting seeing Ontario Premier Doug Ford call for unity, especially against U.S. tariffs, and then Premier Smith just sort of dismissed it, asserting Alberta's autonomy. Says a lot about the current provincial dynamics.
It does. Smith's response really highlighted Alberta's strong push to be seen as its own thing, with its own interests, its own priorities, even when someone's calling for national unity. And
okay, it seems like a fringe view, but the idea of Alberta maybe joining the U.S. has been floated online. That's radical.
It's definitely not mainstream, no. But the fact it even gets mentioned occasionally, it shows you the depth of frustration for some, how willing some are to consider even really drastic options when they feel Canada isn't working for them.
Premier Smith is definitely walking a tightrope, isn't she? Trying to satisfy a base that, according to some reports like CBC's, seems increasingly anti-Canada, while also having to think about the province, the country, the practicalities. It looks precarious.
She is navigating a very tricky political path, yeah. trying to respond to these strong regional feelings. But also, she's the premier. She has that responsibility, considering the long-term fallout of any big moves.
And there's even talk her own party, the UCP, could split over this. You've got groups like the APP pushing for a fast referendum. Figures like Mitch Sylvester warning about unrest if she pushes back too hard.
Yeah, the internal UCP dynamics are definitely something to keep an eye on. Different people wanting different timelines, different levels of commitment to separation. That could absolutely cause friction inside the party.
And finally, we keep coming back to it, but that opposition from indigenous nations based on treaty rights, it just seems like such a fundamental legal and moral barrier.
It really is. The inherent rights, the treaties,
Mm.
they are foundational to Canada. Indigenous opposition adds this huge layer of legal and ethical complexity. Any separatist movement simply has to reckon with that. It can't be ignored.
So wrapping up this deep dive, we've seen the history, the roots of the discontent,
Yeah,
the recent push for a referendum, the divided opinions, and these just massive legal and economic hurdles separation would face.
exactly. It's clear a lot of Albertans are seriously thinking about separation, or at least big changes. But the road from thinking about it to actually doing it, it's incredibly complex, filled with obstacles and a lot of opposition.
It really leaves you wondering, doesn't it, with these deep frustrations in Alberta and knowing how complex separation actually is, what are the long-term effects going to be on the relationship between Alberta and the rest of Canada, even if a referendum never happens or fails? And what does this whole situation force us as Canadians to ask about ourselves, about regional identity, national unity, fundamental questions for the country going forward?